Good day, students. Today we would be discussing about the Bhakti devotionalism in Indian history, especially from the early medieval to the medieval period. We are taking this broad sweep from the early medieval to the medieval period in order to understand broad changes that took place within the conception of Bhakti. The nature of Bhakti devotionalism originated in South India from the 7th century onwards, and we would look at how this particular tradition changed over the course of the next 4 or 5 centuries. We would also look at how Bhakti originated in Indian history and how this particular tradition was influential in the social, cultural, and religious history of the medieval period. So therefore, this particular lecture would give you a grasp of the broad time span from the early medieval to the medieval period in order to understand how devotionalism within Hindu traditions became a significant factor in Indian history. If we move on to the root of the word bhakti, then it is usually translated as devotion. But one must understand that this particular kind of devotion is to one's own deity, that is, his or her personal God. And this stress on the word personal is extremely important. We find that in Indian traditions, from the Rig Vedic period downwards, bhakti has been conceptualized in various ways. It could either have been ritualized bhakti or bhakti in the more important stress on personal attachment. And this personal attachment towards one's own deity is what characterizes the early medieval and the medieval Indian conception of bhakti. The term obviously implies a two-way relationship. It is not just the relationship of a person to one's own God, but also the idea of sharing, of attachment is implicit within this particular idea. The God is also shared by the bhakta. So the words bhaj, which is the root of the word bhakti, means to divide, to share with, and to obtain one's share. The object of bhakti is Bhagavat. The latter word is generally translated as God, but it also means the one who possesses God's worth. Therefore, literally, it means sharing of one's personal God within oneself and with one's own deity. So the divine human relationship is conceived as a very personal form of attachment within bhakti traditions. And this is one of the most important facets of Indian bhakti traditions. The idea of bhakti in the sense of a devotion to one's own personal God is something which is present in ancient Hindu scriptures, including the Bhagavad Gita. But we must understand that during the early medieval period, and especially during the medieval period, this idea acquired new dimensions, new features, and this is what qualifies this particular phase as an important phase of Indian religious history. The South Indian bhakti tradition, which expresses the relationship between the devotee and the deity, is a very intimate, a very personal, an intense, and an ecstatic relationship. It is a personal, passionate relationship between the deity and the devotee. Bhakti traditions in South India expresses itself in various terminologies. For instance, the word anbu, which is the love of the devotee towards one's God, and its reverse, that is the God's personal liking for the devotee, which is arul, are reciprocal terms which are used to understand this concept. The bhakti in South India was expressed through various modes: that of the friend, that of the mother or the father, that of the master, and also of one's bridegroom or one's lover. So bhakti has its different dimensions as it originated in South India. If we move on to consider how this particular idea originated in India, then we must understand that there are several factors behind the rise of bhakti in Indian traditions. For instance, medieval Indian society is generally considered to be caste-ridden, and the type of caste hegemony which was there in early medieval times created a scenario where different castes were discriminated upon and several castes were considered to be privileged. So therefore, the discriminatory system within which Hindu society had been submerged in the early medieval period was looking forward to a change. And this particular change was something that the Bhakti movement brought about. Therefore, the rejection of caste distinctions, and the ability of a person, irrespective of his or her caste orientation, to obtain one's God is something which is implicit within Bhakti traditions. Another suggestion which has been given by scholars is that the Bhakti movement was a reaction to the Islamic intrusion into India, and especially the mass conversions which began to take place from the 13th century onwards. But one must understand that to conceptualize bhakti merely in terms of stopping mass conversions is something which is not correct, because we find that this reaction towards Islam taking place only in North India from the 13th or the 14th century onwards. But bhakti in Indian traditions predates this period. We find that it originated in the 7th century in South India, when Islam was not an important factor in societal change, at least in the case of South India. So, the idea of brotherhood, of equality, and of a community feeling originating in Indian context is something that bhakti was considered to have brought about. Thirdly, we find that the saints and reformers of the bhakti movement also tried to cleanse and rejuvenate Hindu traditions through the devotional mode. And that is why we find that several aspects, for instance, caste, image worship, were things which were usually not looked forward to by certain segments of bhakti devotees. Even the saints tried to move beyond image worship in certain ways. One particular historian, J.T.F. Jordans, has likened the impact of the bhakti movement in medieval North India to the Reformation's impact in the case of Western Christianity in Europe. But be that as it may, the impact of the bhakti movement in India was nevertheless an important segment of Indian social history. Some scholars have also tried to look at the idea of bhakti or devotional surrender to God as an emotion that was the religious equivalent to the political devotion and loyalty towards one's samanta. As we all know, that the early medieval period, which was also regarded as the stage of Indian feudalization, was a phase when we find that the feudalized polity created a scenario where politically we have a hierarchized society. The Samantas were usually the dominant factors in Indian history at this period of time. The religious equivalent of this particular idea, in the case of the bhakti towards God, loyalty towards one personal Lord, is something that has been considered by historians as an important factor. For instance, Burton Stein has stated that the bhakti movement was a social reaction to the town-based and mercantile society of the Jains and the Buddhists in the case of the origin of Tamil bhakti. It may be seen as an expression of the largely rural population with its emphasis on agriculture. This is reflected in the works of the Tamil saints and in their poems as well. It has also been considered by several scholars that the people were tired of the highly philosophical expositions which had been made prior to the 8th century by Shankaracharya. And therefore, this philosophical Hinduism was slowly giving its way towards a new form of devotional bhakti, which began to take shape in the Indian subcontinent. Let us now turn towards the Tamil Bhakti movements in the early medieval period. We find that the cults of Shiva and Vishnu, which rose and flourished in South India between the 6th and the 9th centuries, were the first facets of devotional bhakti in India. And these cults brought about a new spirit of passionate bhakti in the case of India. The Nayanars were the Shaivite saints, believed to have been 63 in number, who represented the high point of early medieval bhakti or the Bhagavata movement in Tamil country. In fact, the term Nayanar is an honorific title. The Nayanars were referred to by others as Nayanars, but they themselves referred to themselves as Atiyar or servant, or sometimes as Tontar or slaves of the Lord. The devotional outpouring of the Nayanars are contained in the poetic renditions or anthologies, which are called Tirumurai. Appar, Sundarar, and Tirugyana Sambandar are regarded as the greatest exponents among the male Nayanars. The lives of 3 women devotees, Nayanars, are also narrated in the Periya Puranam. For instance, Karaikal Ammayar, Tilakkavatiyar, and Mangayarakkarasiyar. In the case of all the Nayanars, devotion invariably meant an expansion of the heart, and therefore service and charity. Now, if we turn to the Alvars or the Azavars, they were Vaishnavite saints who are usually considered to be God intoxicated. In fact, the term Alvar in Tamil means immersed in the divine. The hymns of the Alvars were composed in the 10th century by Nathamuni, and these were named as Nalayira Divya Prabandham. Alvar saints are usually considered to be 12 in number, namely Poigai Alvar, Butha Alvar, Pei Alvar, Periya Alvar, Andal, Tirumajisai Alvar, Kulashekhara Alvar, and so on and so forth. Andal, the daughter of Periya Alvar, is the only woman among the Alvar saints. It is said that each Alvar saint was an incarnation of one of the morphological aspects of Vishnu. For instance, Poigai Alvar, the first of the Alvars, was considered to be the Sangu or the conch of Vishnu. And in a similar way, others have also been designated. As we just mentioned, the outpourings of the Alvar saints have been compiled in the Nalaira Divya Prabandham. The immense importance of these texts to the Tamil country is signified by the fact that these are known as the Dravida Vedam, or the Vedas of the Dravidians. The hymns of the Shaivanayanaars and the Vaishnava Alvars are not only the oldest available literary expressions of emotional bhakti, but they are also the earliest extant Hindu religious literature beyond the purview of Sanskrit. In the Tamil vernacular, the Divya Prabandham, which consists of almost 4,000 songs of the Alvars, and the 12 Tirumurais, which contain around 18,400 plus songs for the Nayanars. The Nayanar and the Alvar saints came from a variety of backgrounds. Most of them, almost two-thirds, were Brahmins, but some were also weavers, potters, and even highway robbers. The Shaiva saint Nandanar and the Vaishnava Tiruppan Alvar were untouchables. While the male saints lived within society, most of the women were social rebels, including Andal. Leadership of the Bhakti movement was predominantly male. Only 3 Shaiva saints were women: Karaikal Ammayar, Mangayyarakkarasiyar, and Isainna Niyar. Among the Alvars, Andal was the only woman. The social impact of Tamil Bhakti led to the creation of a religious community within the social distinctions within which the social hierarchies could be transcended, at least theoretically. If we turn to the theoretical basis of Tamil Bhakti poetry, then we find that these were based somewhat on the Tamil Sangam literature of the earliest times. For example, these were classified into 2 parts. One is the Aham, or the inner part, and the Puram, or the outer part. And we find that the Aham poems were mainly love poems, where anecdotes such as the flowering tree, the rain, and even the beloved awaiting for her lover are symbols which are used to explain and convey the idea of the divine. The Puram poems, on the other hand, expressed the glory, the military prowess, and the generosity of the heroes. And these 2 types of poems can be seen not just in the Sangam literature, but also in the Bhakti literature of the times. According to Norman Curtin, while the Sangam poetry is more impersonal, the Bhakti poetry of the 7th century onwards is more personalized, more intense, and passionate. And we find that several kinds of terms, for example, the first and the second person pronouns, that is I, you, we, these words are time and again used in order to convey a congregational feeling. Thus, on the underlying structure, many Tamil Bhakti poems, we find that there is a triangle linking the poet with the audience, with the deity together. And this community shared feeling is something which is unique to Tamil Bhakti poetry. Tamil Bhakti was institutionalized not just as a popular movement, but also as an institutionalized form of bhakti through royal patronage. And we find that the Pallava rulers of South India especially following Mahendravarman I, and the Cholas, especially Rajaraja I and others, tried to consolidate their power from the 10th century onwards through these modes. So bhakti was one of those modes through which the political rulers also tried to consolidate their power. We find that there were a number of temple activities, temple building activities, which were conducted by these rulers. For instance, the Ranganatha Swami temple at Tiruchirappalli, the Annamalayar temple at Tiruvunmalai, and the Thilai Natarajar temple at Chidambaram were certain instances of this royal patronage. These temple towns, from the early medieval period onward down till the present, have tried to consolidate bhakti as an important feeling within society. So pilgrim devotees who travel to those centers and sing the glories of the Lord, to celebrate festivals, and to perform religious worship and take darshan, were participating in a form of bhakti which is unique to the Tamil country, and it spread later on to other parts of India as well. The Vaishnava and Shaiva hymns, which were collected under royal patronage, and these were instituted, for instance, the Tevaram and the Nalayira Divya Prabandham, were also parts of this particular venture. The Cholas also perpetuated the institution begun by the Pallavas of employing singers to sing the hymns of the poet saints during worship in the temple. Tamil Bhakti was thus the pioneer of emotional, passionate bhakti in India, and this produced a new kind of cultural paradigm. Now we will move on to the bhakti movement in the medieval period. And we will also try to answer the question as to how this Tamil bhakti, which originated in the early medieval period, began to spread all across the Indian subcontinent in the medieval period onwards. Tamil bhakti was infused with the Sanskritic tradition, especially through the composition of the Bhagavata Purana in the 9th century. And it became the principal text through which Vaishnav Bhakti, most importantly, spread throughout northern and eastern India. In the new literature of the Puranas, especially the Bhagavata Purana, we find that the figure of Krishna, who is present even in the epic period from the Mahabharata onwards, was now remolded in a new format. We find that the 9th century Bhagavata Purana began to focus on Krishna mainly as the child and the youthful lover. And this particular relationship was what became the focus of the new bhakti movement in North India. This work became a turning point in the history of the Vaishnavite movement, which was an important component of the bhakti movement. This Puranic development was matched by another movement which began at the same time. We find that there were several religious orders whose monks carried the message of this new form of bhakti. The Vaishnavite mystic Ramanuja, the founder of the Sri Vaishnava sect; Madhava, a Kannada Brahmin who founded the Madhava sect; Nimbarka, the Telugu Brahmin who founded the Nimbarka Sampradaya in Mathura; and also Vallabhacharya, a Telugu Brahmin born at Banaras and who had an enormous influence all across North India and especially Western India, from Gujarat, Rajasthan and Vrindavan. they played a very crucial role in the spread of bhakti in North India. Among the Shaivites, we find that the Lingayats were also spearheading a new form of bhakti, at least in the case of the Shaiva lineages. Another cluster of sects that influenced bhakti during this medieval period, especially in Bengal, the chief of these were the Buddhist Siddhas, the Sahajayana and the Natha Yogis. They all shared a basic tantric approach in which the male-female polarity, the importance of the body, and the continuous use of the erotic, sensuous symbolism became essential. A more effective method of the spread of bhakti ideology in North India was through the use of the local vernacular languages. And we find that they not just created their own hymns in the local vernaculars, but they were also translating many of the Sanskrit hymns and texts which were there into regional and localized languages, so that there was a mass appeal which was being created, and this popularization of the poetic appeal of bhakti is what characterizes North Indian bhakti in the medieval period. We find that Gyanadeva in Maharashtra writing in Marathi, Kabir, Surdas and Tulsidas in Hindi, Shankardeva in Assam writing in Assamese, and Chaitanya and Chandidas in Bengal writing in Bengali and Brajbhasha as well as in Sanskrit in certain cases. And this can be multiplied even further. In addition, devotional poetry was also being composed in Kashmiri, Telugu, Kannada, Oriya, and most of the other languages which came up in the medieval period onwards. The Bhakti saints believed that salvation can be achieved by all, irrespective of one's caste, one's gender. They made no distinction of caste, creed, or religion before God. They themselves came from diverse backgrounds, as we have just mentioned. Ramananda, whose disciples included Hindus and Muslims, came from a very conservative Brahmin family. His disciple Kabir was a weaver. Guru Nanak was a village accountant's son. And Namdev was a tailor. And such instances can be multiplied. The saints stressed on equality, they disregarded the caste system, and they attacked institutionalized religion to a certain extent. They did not confine themselves merely to the propagation of religious ideas. In most cases, their content was also social upliftment. Some of them, for instance, opposed sati and female infanticide. Women were encouraged to join in congregational singing and chanting kirtans. For instance, Mirabai and Lalla of Kashmir composed verses that were popular not just in their own times, but even today. Amongst the non-sectarian Bhakti saints, the most outstanding contribution was made by Kabir and Guru Nanak. Their ideas were drawn from both Hindu as well as Islamic traditions and were aimed at bridging the gulf between sectarian religions. Now I will turn very briefly to focus on how medieval Indian Bhakti was variegated and heterogeneous in character by looking at how Maharashtra and Bengal tried to create new forms of devotionalism in the medieval period. Among the Indo-Aryan vernaculars, devotional bhakti appeared first in Marathi. It began in the 13th century, and we find that Gyaneshwara or Gyanadeva in the 13th century was the first person who wrote a long Maratha commentary of the Bhagavad Gita called Bhavartha Deepika. more commonly known as the Gyaneshwari. And this is considered to be the fountainhead of Marathi devotionalism. More than a commentary, this text constitutes a religious sermon in the form of a song composed in rhythmic prose which is to be chanted. So therefore it was a transition from the commentarial mode of the earlier times towards a new form of congregational singing bhakti in kirtans or in congregational singing, which came up from the 13th century in the Maratha land. The Gyaneshwari was therefore one of those texts which was a pioneer in terms of medieval bhakti emotionalism. Among the other bhakti saints of Maharashtra, Namdev, Eknath, Tukaram and Ramdas were the most important. The center of the bhakti movement in Maharashtra was based around Pandharpur, around the cult of Vithoba, and this was the center of the Varkari pilgrimage, within which the songs of these various Marathi devotional poets began to be sung. Namdev in the 14th century was a contemporary of Gyaneshwar. He was surrounded by other low-caste hymnodists such as Gora, Samavata and others, and he also tried to create a new devotional fervor for the Marathi land. After Namdev, there was a hiatus of almost 2 centuries, and we finally come to the 16th century with Eknath. He was a Brahmin born in a family of celebrated saints, and his mystical teachings, which have been enshrined in the Eknathi Bhagavat, which is the commentary on the Bhagavat Puran, became one of the important documents on Marathi Bhakti. Tukaram in the 16th and the 17th century was a contemporary of Shivaji as well. And his hymns, which are sung even today, is one of those important facets of Bhakti in the Marathi territory, which have still become, or rather they have still attained a quality that has been unparalleled across India. Among the 17th century Marathi saints, Ramdas, who wrote the Dasabodha and who influenced to a certain extent the political movements of the time, was also an important contributor to the Bhakti movement. If we turn to Bengal, then we find that the devotional fervor in this particular area of eastern India was quite different from that of the Marathi land. We find that medieval devotionalism in Bengal, especially as spearheaded by Chaitanya, was based on a variety of pre-Chaitanyite devotional strands, one of them being the Gita Govinda by Jayadeva. And Chaitanya's bhakti was intensely personal, intensely passionate, and the Radha Krishna symbolism was extremely important within this particular strand of bhakti. The erotical mystical theme is, however, seen in Bengali literature right from the 14th century onwards in the writings of Chandidas. And we find that the Krishna Kirtan by Chandidas, which was devoted to the divine couple Radha and Krishna, is filled with profound symbolism. Chandidas's contemporary Vidyapati in the Maithil country in North Bihar was almost expressing the similar type of emotionalism around the same time. However, we find that the type of bhakti which was spearheaded by Chaitanya, which is known as Gaudiya Vaishnavism, tried to collate and instill a type of new emotional bhakti that was unparalleled in other parts of India. Chaitanya, who was born in around 1486 in Navadvip during the rule of the Hussain Shahi rulers of Bengal, was suddenly, almost, he changed his religious outlook from an erudite scholar in his early age to an emotional, ecstatic bhakta after he went to Gaya to perform the Shraddh ceremony of his father. And this intense personal transformation led him to create a new passionate form of bhakti, and he spread this new message all across. He traveled far and wide. He went to Vrindavan, where he identified several of those places which were associated with the exploits of Krishna. And he also traveled to Puri and further down into South India, where he interacted with numerous bhaktas and common people, spreading his message of bhakti. Finally, he passed away in 1533 at Jagannath Puri. Gaudiya Vaishnava darshan prioritizes bhakti over dharma, artha, kama and moksha. In fact, the theory of achintya bheda bhed, or dualistic non-dualism, which is the core of Chaitanya Bhakti, is something which is not seen in other parts of India. Especially, it is quite different from the devotionalism that we just mentioned in Maharashtra. Chaitanya himself did not create any literature as such, apart from the Shikshashtak, but he tried to bring about several scholars, especially the Sara Goswamis or the 6 Goswamis whom he sent to Vrindavan to collate the theological literature of the tradition. And these 6 theologians, namely Rupa, Sanatana, Jiva, Gopal Bhatta, Raghunath Das and Raghunath Bhatta, were those people who tried to collate the theological, the ritual, and also the literary aspects of this tradition. In Bengal, after the passing away of Chaitanya, the Gaudiya Vaishnava Bhakti was spread by the disciples and associates of Chaitanya, namely Nityananda, Advaita, Banshivadan Chattopadhyay, among others. Let us now turn to the impact of the Bhakti movement. We can understand that Bhakti was not just a spiritual, not just a religious, but also a social and a cultural movement which affected almost the entire span of India during the medieval and the early medieval period. The most significant social impact of Bhakti was that it rejected caste distinctions. And we find that there was this evolving idea of equality that was crucial to the mindset of the Bhakti philosophers and devotees. Culturally speaking, we find that Bhakti devotionalism enabled a spirit of communion, of fellow feeling and brotherhood, which had a liberating and harmonizing effect on society. The Bhakti movement, its songs, its literature, definitely had an elaborate impact on the development of Indian languages and literature. And we find that under the influence of the Bhakti movement, several contemporary ruling dynasties and kings did try to bring about policies which were religiously harmonizing. So therefore, they had an impact not just on society, not just on the contemporary people and culture, but also on the ruling classes of the time. Theologically, the Bhakti movement attempted to instill a spirit of religious confidence, of morality in the lives of people. And this is also extremely important to keep in mind. And finally, the impact was also felt across religions. We find that the realization that mutual acceptance and mutual toleration were ideas which were not just to be believed but also to be lived. This came about in the medieval period, a synthesis within society. So, in conclusion, what we can say is that over the broad span from the 7th, 8th down till the 13th, 14th and 16th centuries, from the early medieval to the medieval period, Bhakti had come a long way. From its emergence in the Tamil country, under the Nayanars and the Alvars, down till the different facets of devotionalism across the regions of India, we notice that the Bhakti movement was extremely heterogeneous. And this variety needs to be kept in mind when we speak about Bhakti traditions. As we have identified, the Maharashtrian form of Bhakti and the Bengali devotional strands of Bhakti were quite different. And these nuances need to be kept in mind whenever we discuss about Bhakti traditions. Thank you so much.